Welcome, everybody. It's good to see all of you here today. And we are here to hear from Deva Woodley, a professor of politics at Brown University. But before I continue with her introduction, just a few words about the speaker series. So Professor Woodley joins us today as the second speaker in the Twin Flames speaker series. Twin Flames is an exhibit upstairs in this museum of protest signs and memorial offerings from George Floyd Square in Minneapolis, a 4-square block area that was a barricaded cop-free zone for over a year after Floyd's murder on May 25, 2020, as well as protests and abolitionist organizations here in Maricopa County. The exhibit is the product of a collaboration between the Center for Working Democracy here at ASU, which has been working with the community in George Floyd Square since the uprising, the ASU Art Museum, where we currently are, and the George Floyd Global Memorial, which has been preserving the story of the community at 38th and Chicago in Minneapolis since the uprising. The talks in the Twin Flames series are here and at this time in the afternoon in the museum, so people will have the opportunity to visit the exhibit if you haven't, although I think most of you have. And the exhibit will be here until July 28th, so please visit it. The Twin Flames speaker series highlights scholars who are doing work that is in dialogue with the activists and community leaders in George Floyd Square. Our first speaker, H.L.T. Kwan, recently published the book Becoming Ungovernable, an Abolitionist Feminist Ethic for Democratic Living. And it's a powerful argument for the sort of social transformation imagined by many of the activists in Minneapolis. Deva Woodley's work elevates the work of activists like those in George Floyd Square as necessary for democratic functioning and renewal, and is work that I have had the pleasure of actually discussing with some GFS leaders. Some of them have read her book, Reckoning. And finally, on April 25th, Rashad Shabazz will be joined by the Executive Director of the George Floyd Global Memorial, Janelle Austin, to discuss his new book, Biography of Sound, Prince, Place, and the History of the Minneapolis Sound, which serves as a hidden history, but one that is often discussed and somewhat known on the south side of Minneapolis anyway. So they'll be checking his work, obviously. With those preliminaries in mind, let me welcome Deva Woodley. She is a professor of politics at Brown University and is the author of Reckoning, Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements, published at Oxford in 2022. The Politics of Common Sense, How Social Movements Use Public Discourse to Change Politics and Win Acceptance, also at Oxford in 2015. She's held fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, as well as the Edmund F. J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard. Her research covers a variety of topics from social movements to race and imagination, media communications, and political understandings of economics. Her newest work is on the politics of futurity, particularly what it means to take the concept of political world building seriously in the 21st century, which I believe is the concern of her talk today, the politics of care. So with that introduction out of the way, please join me in welcoming Professor Deva Woodley.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate being able to be here. And I want to thank you in particular, Michael, especially for being a part of curating that amazing exhibit upstairs. I was profoundly moved, not just by the exhibit, but also by the process by which it came to be here. I just think that that kind of sort of collaborative curation, memorializing, but also, I don't know, intellectual and interpersonal community is so the heart of what we are trying to do when we are trying to build the world to come. So yeah, I just wanted to say a really heartfelt thank you for that. I'm so excited to be with you here today, and as Michael said, I'm going to talk to you today about the politics of care, what I learned about when I started studying this social movement, the sort of latest iteration of the Black Liberation Movement, which has manifested in the Black Lives Matter movement, but also, I'm a scholar of 21st century social movements in general, and thinking through the ways that this emphasis on care manifests itself differently in this century than it did in the last, is something that I have been thinking about in ways that have become more rigorous and concrete. So if you'll indulge me today, I'm going to talk not only about the politics of care, but the ways that I think that this orientation toward care, not paternalistic care or dominative care, but the care of enablement and collective self-fashioning should be and can be the basis for the politics of futurity, the politics of the world to come. So this is a little bit experimental for me, and I'm very much looking forward to your engagement with you on this topic, and also the perspectives and experiences that you bring to thinking this through, right? Okay, so first I want to sort of start to talk about the reason why I wrote this book. I'm a scholar of social movements, but I do contemporary social movements, I do contemporary histories. And so when I was in graduate school, the Black American Civil Rights Movement was in what we call abeyance, right? So it was a moment after the sort of civil rights victories of the 20th century were won, but before that there were mass mobilizations about Black liberation yet in the 21st century. So I studied movements that are in process, and at that time I was studying queer movements and also the living wage movement. That book was The Politics of Common Sense. And the thing that I was really interested in was not only the kind of organizational formations of social movements, but also and especially the meanings that they were making, the ways that they were helping us to understand the world as it is, but also the ways that they influence our understanding for political possibility. So that preoccupation is the one that guided me as I began to study the Black Lives Matter movement. I didn't mean to start studying it. I was working on a different book about economic discourse that I still intend to write at a certain point sometime. But then the proliferation of videos of people being harassed, murdered, and maimed by both state authorities and vigilantes started to circulate online, and organizations and conversations started to happen about it, and people started to have uprisings all over the country. And I found myself a little bit frustrated with the writing that was coming out about it at the time. This is around like 2015 or so, because I wasn't sure why the things that were coming out about the Black Lives Matter movement weren't take the time to talk to people who were in the movement, and sort of trying to figure out what it is they thought they were up to, both in the organizations that they were building, the tactics they were using, but also in the political philosophy that they were bringing to bear. And so that's what I sort of set out to do, to try to talk to as many people as I could who were in movement spaces during that time. And it was actually quite difficult, because people in movement spaces, those of you who are involved in organizing might know, especially during this time period, you know, it's risky to be in those spaces, and it can even be sort of dangerous, and you can be wary of outsiders, and you don't necessarily feel completely safe talking to people. And this was in the 2010s, and especially around the time when Trump was elected, and the designation of Black identity extremist, for example, was codified. So in talking to people, what I found was that my little book that was supposed to be on the organizational innovations of the movement started to be a book about the political philosophy of the movement, because it seemed like wherever I was turning, people in different organizations, at different levels of leadership, in different parts of the country, were telling me really similar things about the basis of their values and the principles upon which they were trying to organize. And I thought that it amounted to a political philosophy that was new, that was something that was being born in the 21st century. And so, so that's what I want to talk to you about today. This talk will focus mostly on the political philosophy, which I came to call radical Black feminist pragmatism. It's not what folks in movement call the political philosophy. People call it many different things, but this is not a philosophy that I made up. It's just one that I recorded. And then I sort of tacked a scholarly name on it. So just to be kind of clear about that. But one of the most important parts of this political philosophy, I think, is the politics of care. I'm a person who loves words and definitions, so just to be clear, I take care to be a collection of principles, practices, mores, and laws that facilitate communal gathering and the governance of polities. And an abolitionist politics of care takes as its central remit and function the self and community determination, provision, and distribution of responsibilities that is always required for human life. Care presents us with new purpose and possibilities for living together. Because the purpose of a politics of care is to create a world in which people are enabled to not only live, but to thrive and flourish. So the politics of care that I talk about here is not wholly new, although I think the political philosophy as a whole is new. There have been theorists of care, of course, across many different kind of political and personal identities throughout history. But the valence of this politics of care is rooted in Black feminism in particular. And the tradition that I draw from presents care not only as an ethic, right, so as a way of organizing our personal orientation toward the world and our behavior in it, but actually as a politics that is toward governance. It is not the same as a kind of neoliberal version of care, which tends to be very paternalistic, to figure out what's good for people and then impose it upon them, but is instead really about what does it mean, what does it take to create frameworks in which people have the time, the space, the health, the relationships in order to figure out and implement what is good for their own embodied living and thriving. So part of my sort of argument is that this kind of collective self-actioning is in itself a democratic practice, but it is also a basis in which we can move toward that direction. Okay, so let me kind of back up. I think of care as not only an ethic, but an actual politics. And the thing is that the notion of care has a deep affinity with the voluminous literatures in feminist political theory, for example, Joan Tronto's work in her foundational book, Caring Democracy, where she talks about what it means to be a citizen in a democracy, and she writes that, quote, to care is, as a citizen, is to care for not only other citizens, but to care for democracy itself. However, people in the movement don't center care because of a commitment to the idea of democracy in an abstract sense, or the duty or value of citizenship, but instead in accordance with the fundamental political claim that animates the movement. That is, that Black Lives Matter. That is, that people matter to themselves and to one another. There is no intermediary to turn to between care and the person to legitimate the necessity of caring. You do not need a framework of rights in order to make reasons for care. We simply care because people matter. And that is enough. So let's just pause to consider this. To matter, by its primary definition, is just to exist as physical substance that has mass at rest. That is the physical definition. I love physics definitions. I find those extremely clarifying. As a social scientist, I'm always like, And so I'm thinking through what this means, right? To matter, right? You know, I go to this definition and this is what it says, right? So just sitting with that, to matter is just to exist as a physical substance that has mass at rest. And that entitles you to care. But it also means, to matter, also means to be of importance or significance, and to have content and substance that is distinct from manner and form, right? So this is simply sort of like these definitions, but note how this speaks to politics, right? To be of importance or significance, not because of what you have done, not because of how you're behaving, not because of whether or not you're deserving, not because you have been born into the correct rights framework, right? But just because you have substance and mass at rest, right? This is enough reason to be a part of the polity and to be central to the consideration that that polity undertakes. A matter is also an affair under consideration, the reason for distress. It can refer to the pus that seeps from a wound. One does not matter because of the way one behaves, or the way that one is born or appears, or what one can do. One does not earn the properties of substance and significance via motivation or avocation. One is not bequeathed it as a matter of right. There are explanations for the reasons that we matter, but no justification is necessary. We simply do, and so we deserve care. As a verb, care means to undertake with care, to feel concern or interest in something, to attach importance to it, and to provide for the needs that one observes. In this way, the politics of care begins with the conviction that it matters when whole populations are hurting from harms inflicted by the ways that we have structured society, so that some people are systematically advantaged and others are systematically disadvantaged. It matters that we have designed politics so that some voices are much more likely to be heard and have influence than others, though all may bear an equal claim to citizenship. It matters that in the US, for example, we have a grotesquely huge cultural system that consigns some people to not only be confined in cages, carceral system, not cultural system, carceral system that consigns some people to be confined in cages, but also to what Orlando Patterson has called social death, or that denial of full personhood and mark of disposability. And so to care means to take not only the material deprivation, but the pain that accompanies these political realities seriously, and to work to mitigate the causes and repair the devastating results of the lack of care that is characteristic of our societies as they are currently constituted. A politics of care begins with the notion that it matters if we are hurting, that we must attend to that in the conception and carrying out of our activities of governance. For me, this was like a very profound thing to encounter in movement, to be completely honest with you. I was not trained to really think about emotions in politics or embodiment. Like, that is not where I come from as a political scientist. And so to really encounter in movement spaces and in the philosophy of the movement, this really deep understanding and commitment to the notion, not only that like we should care about people because it's the right thing to do, but instead to really confront this notion that we can't actually organize and create the world that we want unless we care quite deeply about the pain, right, that people are enduring because of the ways that society has been structured, right? And so this notion that it matters that people are hurting, that in and of itself is an impetus to politics, was something that was like revelatory for me. Because if you're trained as a political scientist, or really in social sciences at all, someone's pain, someone's hurt, that's not impetus toward it. That has no explanatory value, right? Like that is not, you know. And so to understand that in this movement and for this movement, it was absolutely one of the most important things to consider when trying to understand the world as it is and the world that might be. So, a politics of care is a reframing of the purpose, priorities, and experience of politics. It is a way of pursuing self-community and political governance that values feelings and somatic embodiment, along with what we are enabled to do in the world as it actually exists. And that, and when I say enabled to do, I mean the things that we're able to do socially and politically, and in terms of the carrying out of our lives. This is different than a rights-based framework, I should say, right? Because in a rights-based framework, it's not as important. There are some approaches, like, so for example, the capabilities approach is a little bit better on this. But for the most part, rights-based approaches are not concerned with what you can actually do in terms of the execution of your actual life or your life experience, but instead only with what rights you can be said to have, right? What the framework allows you to do if you're lucky enough to be able to do it, right? That's the sort of like end of concern in a rights framework. But the politics of care is rooted actually in lived experience. So it even goes beyond notions in the capabilities approach that we should measure how successful a system is based on how well people are able to execute their rights, right? Which is better than the sort of like more traditional liberalisms. But it still doesn't go quite as far as the politics of care, which says, actually, to understand what politics actually is and does, we have to begin in the lived experiences of the people who are living amidst the structures, systems, and institutions that govern our lives, right? And not among the sort of like idealized forms of those, not among the formal rules that govern them, but instead in people's actual experiences of those social forces that intersect and shape the sort of contours and boundaries of their lives, right? We can't understand what politics is, right, unless we begin there, and we certainly can't begin to execute political change that will be enduring and effective unless we begin there. That's the sort of perspective. It is because of these underlying values that the politics of care is able to acknowledge oppression as not only a source of deprivation, but as traumatic, and to understand why that matters, right? Why that trauma actually matters. The politics of care is able to understand interdependence to be fundamental, and this interdependence is not like an aspiration. It's not like we should be interdependent. Instead, the politics of care acknowledges that, guess what? We all do require care, and we will all require different kinds of care throughout our lives. We will be both the receivers of care and the givers of care, and so we are fundamentally, as a fact, interdependent. Whether or not we perceive that, how we perceive that, and whether we use that understanding to shape our politics and our world is a different question. But we take this as a baseline fact, right? And this interdependence is not an aspiration, it's not an ethic, it's not a matter of morality. The politics of care takes interdependence to be material, and to be a fact. But this is something that is not centered in liberal theory in general, or even traditional leftist politics. This is also why the politics of care has in it the practices of, and these are practices that I sort of identified within movement, practices of unapologetic blackness, which is a kind of rejection of respectability politics, the practice of the celebration of Black joy, which is a counter to a resource against the necropolitics of anti-Blackness in the world as it is. And also sort of several other factors. Since I'm a political scientist, I couldn't help but sort of systematize things. So the things that I identified that were present, it seemed to me always, was this acknowledgement of oppression as a social trauma, this reality of interdependence, this unapologetic Blackness, this defense of Black joy, this insistence on accountability, right? Which is the kind of flip side of interdependence. Because interdependence without accountability will lead you into some nasty little places, right? Down lanes of not only domination and oppression, but codependence in various kinds of ways that are not beneficial interpersonally at the community level or sort of at the macro social level either, right? So interdependence and accountability have to go together. And then the last aspect of this politics of care, which was the one that I think the political analysis that explained the world as it is and what kinds of values and basis they were working from to try to think about what they wanted to come next and what it would really mean for Black people to live in a world where they could live and thrive. And the notion of this sort of thriving and the need for this Black thriving. And the reason that it's both specific but also pluralistically universal is because it comes from that same place as the Black feminists' notion codified in the Kawaii River Collective, which is that this whole notion of a margin to center ethic, this notion that if Black people can live and thrive, right? If marginalized people can live and thrive, that means that everybody has to be able to live and thrive, because you can't actually get there. You don't get to a world where Black people can live and thrive unless everyone is thriving. So, so it's a very particular way of looking about things that is rooted in the lived experience of the marginalized, not in a kind of fetishized way, right? Not in a kind of oppression Olympics way. Sometimes, especially when I was sort of writing this book and before it was out, I would go places and sometimes people would be like, well, like, how do you decide who the most marginalized is? And I was just like, this is not really a competition, right? The purpose is not really to decide who is most marginalized. It is a particular approach to understanding political problems. And eventually I came up with this analogy because I got asked this question so many times, and I was just like, you know, I came up with this analogy because think about the systems that produce and reproduce oppression and domination in our lives, right? So we think about, if we think about sort of like bell hooks, when we think like, white supremacist, cis-hetero patriarchy, right? If we think about these systems, capitalism as it currently exists, patriarchy, white supremacy and anti-Blackness, these are extremely wide-ranging systems of both ideology that are institutionally reinforcing in various ways, but also are embedded in cultural mores and ways of thinking, right? The sort of like notions of hegemony that we've seen before. So this is a really tangled web of influences, right? It's a really tangled web of things that are manifest not only materially in ways that we can measure, though it is that, but also in more ephemeral ways of just our habits and our ways of thinking. And so how is it that you begin to try to undo that, right? How is it that you begin to try to unravel the sort of net of these systemic forces? And the idea of a margin to center ethic, of a politics of care, is that you actually try to begin at the sort of center part of this knot, right? So if you think of this web of relations as having become this knot of oppression and domination. And the thing about a knot like this, just as a regular knot in the material world, is that what happens to a knot if you are trying to undo it, or you think you're trying to undo it, and you just pull on any string? Right. So, so it's an analytical approach, right? That basically says that we start at the margins. We try to start with lived experience because we really are serious about the undoing, right, of this knot of oppression. And so that means that we're not sort of theorizing from an abstract place. We have to really follow the line of where these intersections go in order to know where to pull and where to cut to undo what has been done, right? Does that make sense? So that's the notion that's kind of underlying a margin to center ethic and the way that it relates to a politics of care. Okay, so I don't know how I'm doing on. Okay.
No, you're fine.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think a politics of care consists of the activities associated with building and achieving power for the purposes of governing. These activities include developing the understanding, working out the preferences, arbitrating conflicts, galvanizing participation, guiding collective action, and making decisions as a group, constituency, or polity. In the dominant liberal conception, politics is the domain in which we manage competition over naturally divergent interests. And in both political theory and colloquial usage, politics derives its legitimacy insofar as it has legitimacy from the rational and strategic rather than the emotional and need. So it presented a problem for me when I first started of how I could possibly conceptualize a politics of care. And I was very insistent on calling it a politics. Many people talk about an ethics. And I was just like, first of all, ethics is not my deal. I don't know about that, right? I'm not qualified to talk about it, first of all. But second of all, I really wanted to insist that this was more than a moral orientation, but was really a guidance for the doing of collective governance, right? And so the idea that I sort of am thinking through or have come up with is that what if we conceived the currency of political aspiration not as interests, right? Whether real and material or constructed from some indistinct, yet somehow naturally decisive miasma of desire and cost benefit, but instead in terms of dignity and flourishing, okay? What if we decided that politics was not about interests, but was about dignity and flourishing? Such a change is one of orientation toward the motivation and ends of politics, not in the nature of the political enterprise, right? So that means to say that a politics of care is not about making politics nicer, right? Or about being nice, right? The competition to direct the attention and resources of the polity will always remain fierce. And movement actors, I don't think, balk at hard fights. However, the politics of care sees interests as disconnected from the concern for dignity and flourishing, for the dignity and flourishing of the individual in context. So that means that a politics of care has just different ends, right? And also different methods to get to those ends. But it doesn't make politics sweet, right? It can't be that. We're in the business of governing. But to what end? For what purpose? Okay, so what else should I say? I want to say that the politics of care in movement is often manifested most concretely in this notion of healing justice. This notion of healing justice is one that comes out actually of the disability justice movement. And it is, I think, a really profound notion in that healing justice, what it claims in that framework and the way that it's been people have learned from it in the Black Lives Matter movement is that one thing about disability justice movements and this notion of healing justice is that the problem in disability, and then also the problem, again, with marginalized people, is not in the body, right? It's not in the body. It's in the construction of the world that can either accommodate and facilitate the thriving of that body or not, right? So this comes from disability justice in a very sort of like material and concrete way. The problem is not with the body that cannot, for example, walk, but instead with the spaces and places and mores that make it impossible for someone with a body that cannot walk to move through the world in a dignified way and in a way that allows them to flourish, right? So that's one thing about healing justice that's really important. It locates the problem in a different place, right? The other thing about healing justice that's really important is that embedded in the notion of healing justice is that it's not only about the healing of the individual, whether that's the physical healing or the psychological healing of the individual, or rather, that healing cannot take place outside the work of changing the environment that causes the harm, right? So one cannot heal from the trauma that oppression and domination imposes, even though it imposes those things on us as individuals in our own specific circumstances, just by doing individual work, right? Individual self-work. That's important, But the salve, right, the thing that actually allows us to heal has to be also working in community, in concert, collectively, to try to change the conditions that cause the harm in the first place. That's a part of the healing process in this notion of healing justice. So again, it lends itself to thinking about how care can be a politics, right? Indeed, how it must be a politics, sort of on this view. So I keep getting ahead of my text and then I have to just repeat myself. So healing thus is a multidimensional enterprise. It is necessary not only for the individual but also for society, and that means the approach to attaining healing must be from the individual as they exist in and change the socio-political with their fellows, right? I think that the politics of care is also based on an understanding of ourselves as always situated. So it has a slightly different sort of unit of analysis than other frameworks, either liberal individualism or socialist collectivism. Instead, it's about the individual in context, that is, in relation, right? It's about people as individuals, but they are never sort of isolated and by themselves. It's always about the context, both sort of local and interpersonal, but also at the community, right, meso level, and then at the macro level, it's about the relations between self and others, and the way that we constitute those relations, the way that those relationships either restrict or enable our lives. Okay, so that means that to account for oneself is also to account for one's social condition, location, and connectedness. That means in the political philosophy of the movement, the individual is not the basic unit of analysis, nor is an imagined unitary collectivity, but instead attention is focused on this context. Structural conditions and interpersonal independence are thus taken as always relevant to public problems and their solutions. I think previous to this movement, I'm not sure that accountability was a very big kind of mainstream political category, right? It has like legal balance, but sort of talking about interpersonal accountability, I think, used to be quite rare. And so what does this mean? Accountability is a deeply pragmatic and democratic orientation. It's about taking responsibility for one's action, but also, and really crucially, it's about acknowledging that since oneself is always situated and in context, the actions that you take may have unintended consequences. It's also about being in community, active community with people. It's not an abstraction. One is actually accountable to those one is in relationship with. And so there are boundaries also to that accountability, which is really important. You can't just be accountable to the world at large. What would be the terms of that, right? So it really is about this situatedness and this relationality, which is quite important. And then these questions of unapologetic Blackness and joy as a political resource. These were things that I encountered in the movement that were very self-consciously employed. So that means, right, a movement that is in defense of Black lives, that is very much grounded, or at least anchored, right, by these moments of grief, outrage, and sort of repetition of the horror of the sort of murder and harassment and other kind of encounter with both the state, police, and vigilantes, is one in which, and this sort of like urgency around responding to that, is one in which one might not think that there would be structured time for joy. But there very much is in this movement. Now, this is not that unusual in social movements, generally speaking, meaning to say that social movements always have culture that is part of what they are doing and what they produce. some of that is always joyful culture, right? So, you know, in queer movements in the 90s and 2000s, right, you had raves and you had things but this movement, this particular iteration, really understands joy as a political resource and builds that into the organizing work. This is partly from lessons that they learned from, surviving elders of the 20th century civil rights movement. People telling them that we didn't do this, we didn't prioritize this, and it caused problems for sustainability. It caused problems in terms of our relationships. It caused problems in terms of our health and ability to live, right? And so some of the lessons that people learned is to really understand joy as a source of sustainment, of relationship building, but also as a source of inspiration and a blueprint and rubric for what it should feel like to live in the world that you're trying to build, right? It is about, right, a reclaiming of the definition of and the connotations of Blackness as being beyond suffering and pain, but about also embodied joy in a very profound and sort of macro historical way, but also in a very mundane, we are currently dancing in the street kind of way. So that was also important. And then the last aspect is this unapologeticness, right? This is something that we see originating in the Black Lives Matter movement, but it has been hugely resonant, right, in terms of lack of apology, the unapology, right, is this notion that marginalized peoples and Black peoples are not going to come to the authorities in the sort of structures, institutions in the world that it is in a posture of apology. And this is really, I think, firmly rooted in the notion that the generation that began this movement was sort of came of age in the Obama era. And I think that one thing that the Obama era taught young Black activists in particular was that respectability was not going to save anybody. That you can be as respectable as was humanly possible, and that was not going to earn you out of anti-Blackness. And so one thing that this movement did was to say, okay, then we're not doing that. We're just not doing that anymore. Because also that respectability is not only a kind of failed route to political acceptance and political power, but it's also in conflict with this Black feminist margin to some center ethic. It means that if we're trying to police our own, right, then it means that we're not taking seriously the lived experiences of those who are most at the intersection of the most oppressive forces in our society. So the incarcerated, sex workers, people with mental illness, the poorest among us, right? Like people who are at the intersection of the most dominative institutions that we have are people whose experiences we should be learning from, not out of necessarily altruism, but in order to have the kind of political analysis that is actually necessary to undo the world as it is and to build the next world, right? Okay, so now I want to talk very specifically about the politics of care. So these are the elements that I think are included in the politics of care as I observe them in the Black Lives Matter movement. But how is that related to a politics of futurity? Well, as I said, the thing that I think makes care a politics in the movement is because it is a different orientation toward the means and ends of politics itself. But to what purpose? Another thing that I encountered in movement spaces was this really weird way of strategizing, at least I thought it was a weird way of strategizing, which is that people would be in meetings and would say, imagine that it's the year 2080, And we are, you know, grandparents rocking on the porch, and we won, right? We're living in the world that we won. What will we have had to do to be in that world? What would it be like, but also what would we have had to do to get there? And I thought, this is a really interesting way of trying to strategize about what to do in the present day. It's imaginative and fantastical in a sort of certain way, but it's not utopian because it's actually about what you're gonna do, right? It's not about like sort of the idealized world, it's about we are living in the world that we want. What do we have to do now to get to that world? And so this pragmatic imagination was something that I found to be the first time that I thought about what it would mean to have a politics toward futurity, right? And I talked, and the reason I use the word futurity and not futures or something else is because futurity is this orientation toward rather than a fixed point that we reach, right? The future is going to come one way or another. Like we don't have to, you know, do anything, right? The future is going to be here. I mean, it's here now, and now it's here now, right? Like the future is just coming. Futurity is a particular orientation toward the world to come, and I wanted to sort of think about that or talk about that. So this notion of the world to come has a certain fragility. The way that I understand it, it's sort of animated by Black political thought and culture, particularly Afrofuturism. And this is a notion that Ytasha Womack writes about, and I'm going to quote him here. He says, "There's something about African American culture in particular that dictates that all cultural hallmarks and personal evolutions are recast in a historical lineage. Whether it's the concept of prophecy and speaking into the future or tropes of the past shadowing the present, whether by need or narrative, many speak as if the future, past, and present are one. The threads that bind can be as divergent as a tersely worded tweet, musical chord, fiery speak, or ancient kinetic symbol. But there's an idea that the power of thought, word, and imagination can somehow transcend time. Just as the right words and actions can speak the future into existence, the same can recast the past too, and indeed both are necessary." So a politics of futurity is moving from this conviction that futures are something that we build. And then the question of our politics is how we want to go about building that world. This notion of futurity, I think, is really important right now at this moment, because one of the things that I think characterizes this critical juncture, which has a lot of actually parallels to the 20th century at this time. If you kind of check back last century this time, there are some very, very strong parallels right down to the pandemic. Like it's very intense reading histories of the early 20th century right now, which I have been doing actually, because the parallels are so strong. But one of the things that I think is really different is that at that moment, across political and ideological and identity spectrums, there was this very strong belief and conviction that people were going to make the 20th century different than the 19th century. There was this belief that people were really going to bring the future on, that they were going to make the future. But I think the notion at the end of the 20th century, of the end of history, really stole that conviction from us, right? In terms of in Zeitgeist, right? In terms of, in the kind of common sense, is that notion was very explicitly about, we've sort of at least conceptually solved all the big problems. Now what's left is to try to put that, to perfect the things that we've said we want to do. We're not doing it anywhere, but we've said we want to do it, so let's like sort of try to figure out how to do that, right? But what it left us with were all of these sort of world historical problems, both the ones that we inherited really from the 19th century, in addition to other catastrophes, right? Chiefly environmental catastrophe, right? That we have to figure, but without the spirit toward futurity, which will actually allow us to face those challenges. And so that's the other thing about politics of futurity. It is moving through the world and politics and collectivity with this conviction that we have as much right and responsibility to shape the world as any of our ancestors. And that is our responsibility to do that, right? To do that now. So these are the things that I'm thinking about, and these are the ways that I think that a politics of care can kind of guide us. Because what if we decide right now in 2024 that the purpose of politics in the 21st century is to build a world in where most people can live and thrive with dignity, where we measure the success of polities by the amount of flourishing, right, that exists within them. That would be a really profound change, but I argue that it's not a utopian change, right? My vision is not a utopian vision, and it's one that's widely shared. It's really a question of pragmatic imagination. We will not be the first generation to make the world. There are generations that have done that before us. I mean, that's why we study history, that's what we're doing. So what does it mean for us to be the generation that builds the 21st century in which we can all live and thrive? Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions, which I think some of it is clarifying. Some of it I think is going to push in some directions, which I'm interested in. So, I should also mention that our interest in the politics of care comes from a number of places. Feminist social reproductive theories of social reproduction. We are interested in it because we're in a very active relationship with care workers of various sorts, so that's both healthcare workers, but also people like teachers who are responsible for raising good citizens and so on like that. And also because our work in George Floyd Square started out as actually a study of protest medics as an example of the politicization of care work in the wake of the pandemic and so on like that. Right here in Phoenix, we had a really interesting protest during the pandemic when Ford nurses went out to an anti-masking rally at the state capitol in their scrubs. And just stood there with their arms behind their backs looking at the Capitol. And they were yelled at, spat on, all of that by the protesters. But that was the kind of, nobody organized it. They organized it on their unit that day. They were tired of the anti-masking protests and they were mad that their coworkers were dying during the pandemic, right? That kind of mobilization around care, if you will, something that seems to be becoming more prevalent, but at the same time is partially becoming more prevalent because in a certain way our society is caring less as a society.
Absolutely.
So maybe you could tell me a little more about why this is happening in this moment. You're giving an account, which I think you usually want to do, which is really rooted in the discourse of movement participants, right? And you're kind of elevating that into a philosophy or a program or a way of thinking about what links all of these things, right? But there's also the other side of the context, right? Which is what's going on in the rest of the world where all of a sudden caring starts mattering a lot more, and for whom and why. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I think that care has become more salient now for a lot of different reasons. So one of the first things that I noticed about this movement since I study discourse is that you remember, you're old enough to remember, right, that self-care as a concept is very new. Like, it didn't exist. 10 years ago, you couldn't say, like, if you had said self-care, people would have been like, I mean, I guess so, right? Like, there was no, like, sort of notion of self-care. So, okay, so this is significant for a number of reasons. One, this was the first and most popular phrase that came from a movement that became completely mainstreamed and popularized, and then of course commodified very soon. But still, it came from this Audre Lorde quote, right, that circulated endlessly online in 2014, 2015, right? And people who had nothing to do with movement, right, who were not necessarily invested in it would see this quote and were like, yes, absolutely, 100%. And that is because the political economy is such that really, unless you are in the very, very top 1% of wealth, right, the notion that your time should be colonized by waged work, that your future and the future of your children is precarious, is one that you have to contend with every day. And in the current sort of like, neoliberal capitalism, there really isn't any time or space to care for yourself or your family if the work can't be waged, right? It's not seen as significant. You're supposed to always be available for waged work, and everything else comes second, right? This is detrimental to life, right, and living. I don't even just mean in a sort of like, it's not nice, right? That we don't like it. But I mean, like, it's literally hurting us. It's harming us. Our cortisol levels are through the roof. We're stressed all the time. Anxiety, generalized anxiety is just like basically a steady state for most people most of the time, right? It's not because there's something wrong with us as individuals. It's because we've structured society such that that's the way we live. So people are hungry for a conception of care that brings it into the realm of the political, right? Because the realm of the political is the realm in which we can do stuff about things together. Within liberalism, and especially neoliberalism, the realm of the political is the realm of collectivity. Otherwise, everything else is for you on your own, right? You better deal with it on your own, right? So bringing things into the realm of the political is the way that we can start to think of things as collective problems that can be solved. So I think that's why that was taken up with so much gusto, by people near and far, and also why there's so much potentiality for this politics of care to be the root, the ground, from which we kind of push off into the 21st century, because it is what so many of us are hungry for, and realize that we need, even if we don't understand how we want to get there.
So just to expand on it a little bit, I mean, neoliberalism, for all of its faults, doesn't care about care.
No.
It also doesn't politicize care work, right?
Or enable it in any way. Yeah.
Right, it's just neutral.
Yeah.
Right? But what we've been seeing now is care workers are under attack. The idea of care is that it's not coming out of solidarity or just basic, humanistic care for one another. It's interested. It's being done to manipulate you. So the pandemic taught us all of this, that like public health isn't about public health, it's about a democratic agenda or the deep state or whatever. And that would be the other sort of contextual thing that I'm thinking about. And then on the other side of it is the self-care thing you see all the time. In George Floyd Square, they have self-care fairs once a month.
Yeah, sure.
It gets talked about constantly in these movement spaces. But one of the things that I really kind of noticed about this was that it's really distressing that that despite all of that talk, almost nobody's actually being cared for. So movement spaces like George Floyd Square or Ferguson, these are places of profound mental health.
Yes.
Trauma, all kinds of problems related to both protests, other things that have happened. And the idea that either you could organize caring for those people to do it on their own, or even in community with the rest of the people that they're around in their movement spaces, is really inadequate, right? Your position in care as something of a universal, which I think people like Joan Tronto and others always want to do, we will all at some point in our lives be in a position where we're dependent on others, right? And we all have been in positions in our lives where we've been dependent on others we've already lived at. We might have forgotten it, but, because we like to think of ourselves as independent, bourgeois individuals who are mostly thinking beings, not biological beings, so like that, right? But there is a universalism there. But, since you're talking about it coming out of these very specific movement spaces, I wonder about the particularity and its relationship to the general in that context, and also whether it is possible to start incubating that new kind of world in an autonomous space, or whether it requires broader political transformation to be realized, which is a key question for all these movements.
Well, I think it requires both. I think it can't be either or. Because autonomous spaces won't have the resources to do it over time. And without the autonomous spaces to experiment with methodologies, we won't know how to do it at the scale that it needs to be done. So it's both and, it's not either or. And that's another thing about what I hope to think through about the politics of futurity is the age of dichotomy has to end. Sorry. I mean, look, the age of binaries has to end. That's what all this flailing, or look, it's over, guys. We have to take spectrum seriously. We have to take ambiguity seriously. We have to understand productive tension in a different way than we have before. And I don't say this as like a guru. I don't know how to do any of this stuff. And I'm born into a different age. So I don't I don't pretend to be like a prophetess, right? I don't know how this is gonna get done. People are gonna have to figure out how this is gonna get done. But I will say that, we talked about this at lunch, is that I don't want to talk about it in the way or from the view of what we can't do, but instead what we can. And so the question of should it be this or this is a limiting question. It has to be both. So how do we make it both? That's a very hard question, but it's not an impossible question. And it's absolutely true in terms of particularity, who has access to care, right? The whole wellness industry, right, is a very rich white industry. Access to that kind of care is also really exclusive. But I hate to tell you this, most of that stuff doesn't help kinds of care that connect you to community. I mean, these are things that we know that we've learned from psychology, for example, right? What is the best protection from a trauma response? Right? So trauma is this is a side thing. So now you've got me started. Okay. So when I was, trauma also is a thing that is talked about a lot more in mainstream conversations now than 10 years ago, right? 10 years ago, you weren't just talking about trauma all the time, right? Just colloquially, right? My 9-year-old would talk about trauma, right? And I'm just okay, right? Let's be clear about what this is. So what trauma actually is, according to psychologists, is it's not when a bad thing happens, right? So bad things happen, really terrible bad things, right, happen. It's the response that happens in the people that witness it, that it's a trauma response or not, right? And the trauma response is basically being frozen in the moment of the terrible thing and not being able to process life outside that moment, right, from then on. That is a trauma response, right? It's always being at T-1, right, the moment before the thing happens, and then after that moment, everything is affected by that, if you have a trauma response. Bad things that happen and you don't have a trauma response are things that you remember, but they don't mark sort of the rest of your life through the filter of that event, right? So psychologists have found that trauma responses and, for example, disasters, right, and things like this, the number one thing that guards against a trauma response, community. The number one thing that guards against a trauma response is you have people with whom you are in relation, whether they're there or not there, who you can process that moment with, whom you feel cared for, right, with, and whom you can, basically work through it in community, right? So the things that help us to be healthy are actually the things that put us in relation with one another and that make us able to work through whatever it is we need to work through, for better or worse, in relation, right, in community. So I think that's one thing that's really important to know about, like, sort of the commodification of self-care, is that it doesn't work. And so people keep searching. And the things that we find that actually do work, we find in these instances of community building and a lot mutual aid. Like, so for example, some of the things that I found, and not all of this is at scale per se, but for example, there was an explosion of mutual aid sort of organizations and practices during the pandemic. And one of the things that I found most interesting about it is that in many communities, the mutual aid during the pandemic was the site of a revitalization of civil society, period, in those places. So for example, in the little community that I happened to live in at that time, Beacon, New York, people started, first of all, everybody started gardening at that time, including myself, right? Like, I started growing food. I had never grown food before in my life, right? Like, so everybody in my neighborhood was like growing food. We had all this, so we had all these like excess crops. And we really did. In our kind of like backyard. And finally somebody was like, I've heard of these friendly fridges that people are putting together in Brooklyn, and we could totally have one here in Beacon. So we have like this little, they still do have it, right? I haven't moved away exactly, but a friendly fridge, an open pantry that we set up at that time. We ended up supplying vegetables to the local public school, right? And all of these practices, some are still in practice now, some have gone away, but what happened was, in coordinating and doing all of that, new civil society was born. So that the people who were involved in that, whether they're doing stuff with gardening and friendly fridges now, some are, some aren't. Some are running the library board, some are on city council, some have organized around Palestine and Israel, right? Like this is a place where people learn to work together and then create new political possibilities through that work. So, yeah, so that's the other thing. So these are the ways that the politics happens and the politics of world building happens that we don't necessarily see, right? Because we don't understand them in the first instance to be political, but they are deeply and profoundly political, particularly in a world in which, right, that's the other thing about neoliberal capitalism is that this is the whole thing with Robert Putnam, bowling alone, right? We don't have time to be with each other anymore. The sort of block clubs and fraternal organizations and all of these things have been in decline for many decades. And so these mutual aid organizations, community organizations that were born during the uprisings, but also the pandemic, have been a site of the revitalization of the kind of things that you actually need to have democratic politics. One of the reasons that democracy is in decline everywhere is because of the political economy that's stolen from us time to be citizens.
Good point.
And this is the other thing, as a small d democracy person, which I am an evangelist for democracy, I will tell you that. And I don't mean representative democracy, et cetera, like I mean collective self-governance. As a democracy person, one of the things in political science, if you go to graduate school, the first thing you learn is like the collective action problem and why do people even work together? Everybody's a free rider. We don't need, all of this, like this is the first thing that's foundational to the study of American politics. But what I always look at is what happened in 2020 when the political economy was forced to slow down. Was just forced to slow down, right? For like 8 months, wasn't even that long. What did people decide to do? Get involved in politics. Get involved in governing their own communities. Get involved in supplying what they needed for one another, right? And so for me, it's a really important object lesson about, and this is another thing about intersectionality, right? Like, so it's a really important object lesson about this intersection between the political economy that structures our lives and what else it disallows for us, what other kinds of possibilities that it takes off the table. So yeah. I don't know.
So, when you're talking about civil society and bowling alone, reminds me of one of the only things that Thea Scotchball's ever said that I actually really was amused by, where she said, obviously, Robert has never been to a bowling alley. Nobody is bowling alone. They're bowling with their friends, which is exactly what mutual aid is. People are doing civil society with their friends.
And we had a center party where we went bowling. It was fun. Yeah.
So, questions from all of you for Professor Woodley?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack.
And I think you two have priority, because I know you might have to go somewhere else.
We have to go to another book talk at 4 or
Yeah.
something. But I just wanted to say, thank you for focusing on the politics of care in the way that you are. And I have been studying women's labor activism and the feminist labor movement almost all of my life. And it was only in the latter period that my colleague and I started asking women activists, who takes care of you? And people start crying. It is so difficult to manage all the care work they do for their families and their communities and their workmates, that it's a highly gendered thing. And I think that women are paying a big price for the care work that they do in their own bodies. And then I think some of the misogyny, particularly that we're seeing now, is by men who don't want to take care of themselves. They want women to take care of them. Just my little observation, not an empirical study, but so I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about the gender dimension of the politics of care.
Well, yes. I mean, the politics of care comes out of, at least the tradition that I'm talking about comes out of Black feminism. So it's very much gendered in terms of, it's kind of a woman-centered way of thinking about politics. Because, oh gosh, I'm gonna get myself in trouble. But okay, so.
Well, you're not doing it.
You're among other we're all trouble.
No, I'm gonna get myself in trouble because, okay, so when you are gendered as a woman, and the care responsibilities that go along with that, socialization, unless you manage to completely reject it at every turn, which is like very, very hard. In terms of, because it's not just like whether or not you decide to have children, but it's also the bulk of care for aging relatives is gonna fall on you, right? Like just interpersonal care, right? Like the literal maintenance of relationships is period, right, is demanded more of women. If you happen to be a woman teacher, guess what? You're doing more care work than your male colleagues. If you happen to be right, exactly. So it's a gendered experience, just period. But it makes you think about what relationality is and means in a different way, I think. And so I think there's a reason why Black feminism comes from this place that ends up being an abolitionist politics, which is a politics based on the notion that no one is disposable, that you can't throw anyone away, no matter what they've done. And I think it comes in part from the lived experience of being in your various relationships, in your various community roles, the ones who are tasked with the labor, both material and emotional, of keeping people alive.
Right.
Keeping people alive and memorializing the dead and all of that, right? And so I think it gives rise to a different kind of, a different kind of politics.
I was thinking about this politics of care. I have a daughter that lives in Seattle, and they had something called the CHOP there. Were you able to get a chance to go to that?
I did not go, no.
Okay. All right, well, so that went on, for those of you who may not know, it was I guess you could call it, they would call themselves the radical people of Seattle, got together and took over this area, and they closed down one of the police stations, and you know, they were there for a number of weeks. So, my daughter works with an organization called Young Women Empowered, so she works with teenage girls. But part of what happened was that she was seeing that trauma